Has released the results of a poll commissioned to PSB Research run amongst young South Africans, which they say gives some unique insight into the principles, attitudes, concerns and ambitions this demographic between the ages of 18 and 24 has ahead of the general elections on Wednesday. Some of the findings revealed that young people feel limited by the choices on the ballot. Also, 58% of those polled said they'd be voting for the ANC, 12% for the DA and 9% for the EFF. Now, from the foundation, we're joined by Ruby Ichikowitz, who's the head of the youth component at the foundation. Thank you so much for making the time. Now, Stats SA says 1.8 million young people between the ages of 18 and 19 were eligible to vote as first-time voters, but only 341,186 registered. This is the same sentiment as your research, isn't it?
Absolutely. It is a little bit worrying. The majority, 40 of people polled in our survey, showed that they were concerned about the future of South Africa, although they were completely disillusioned about what political options there are today and the reality that they're facing. And we see that voter registration is something that political parties have been fighting very hard to try and gain, but our survey, the science behind it, shows that little has resonated with the youth.
Yeah. I also see that you avoided that overused word, voter apathy, which is one gets that sense coming out of this. Was that deliberate? Yes and no.
We actually see that it's more voter frustration. We see that the youth is disappointed as the born-free generation. Their baseline comes from a democratic South Africa. And with today's situational awareness amongst the youth of people being able to be completely interconnected with each other, have transparency into the functioning of our institutions, we've really lost a lot of trust in the democratic process and in the South African institutions. So voters, in the opinion of the survey, are frustrated with what the government has provided, and they left stranded and lost as to what could be the potential solutions for them.
So why did the foundation find it necessary to consider the impacts of the declining trust of youths on South Africa's future?
So this study is actually part of an Africa-wide survey that we're conducting specifically into the youth.
Because is that so? Related to voting?
Related to youth issues in general.
Okay.
It's very broad amongst the geographic
So this just
divide.
happened, voting just happens to be the issue in South Africa right now?
Absolutely.
But it could be any other issue?
We're polling against many different verticals in the different countries, and the results of the survey were particularly applicable for the election now. And we find that the youth are incredibly important in gauging what the sentiment is for Africa going forward, because we have seen a complete renaissance continent-wide on how the youth want to engage in their local countries, how they want to engage in politics and business. And we commissioned the study as a way to set the tone for us to understand and to be able to share the understanding of what the next few years are going to look like.
We've got a graphic that's up right now. Let's stay with that. I'm just talking to my producers. Your overall findings in terms of party preference, pretty much reflecting several other polls which put the ANC ahead and then the DA following and the EFF. What did you ask your respondents?
So we had completely non-biased questions and made sure PSB did a fantastic job of running a very professional survey. So these questions were amongst others, and they were quite simple with how to which parties they were going to choose. What's interesting for us is that there were also figures on the current state and on the trust and mistrust of the ANC and other political parties. One of the interesting outcomes that we see here is an uptick in planning to vote in the election. Now, this is assuming that everyone is registered, and what's interesting in the wave of registrations in January.
Which is the kicker, they haven't registered.
They haven't registered, but in January's registrations, 81% of the 700,000 registrations were in the youth bracket. So we're seeing a resurgence now of, I think, given the political events that unfolded towards the end of last year and January, it might be too late, but we are seeing a resurgence in concern, in disillusionment, and in going out and trying to do something. So is it a bit too late for the registrations? perhaps so, but
not even a
at least the
conversation.
January one was an interesting indication.
You say that they feel neither excited or represented in the poll. What would they like to see happening to increase youth representation? Not in the poll, in the voting, whoever's representing political parties, on the ballot, they don't feel represented there. What would they like to see happening?
So the two biggest issues that the youth brought up were joblessness and corruption.
Yeah.
And on the flip side of that, what they want to see is they want to see a political party delivering on their promises, which are going to create the environment for there to be employment, for there to be jobs, and for basic services to be delivered.
Really?
And not to be lost through corruption.
I would have thought that the youth of 2019, when asking for representation, would have wanted more activities coming from their side to government and not the other way around.
So there absolutely is that link. Again, they feel disillusioned and disappointed because their voice isn't heard. And part of that problem is because on a whole, and we saw this interestingly during Fees Must Fall, youth feel that their voice gets lost in translation. And I think political parties were a little bit late to wake up to realize that they do actually represent a large proportion of the
It's a bit of a
voting
challenge
population.
getting that voice, though, because there's such a multiplicity of voices, isn't there? And people wanting different things.
So one of the things that the survey actually showed to us is that you're right, the youth are completely fragmented, although the popular perception of them is slightly different to what the science showed in the survey. So, for example, many analysts feel that the EFF is the party for the youth. They want radical change. They're speaking to the youth. There's a fair amount of youth representation. They're looking back on history.
Even at their rally yesterday, the leader of the EFF was decrying the fact that there's still such a senior representation in Parliament as opposed to showing this, reflecting this demographic. So this is what analysts have been saying. Now, our poll disagreed slightly with this. The poll came out with a statistic to show that 81% of youth surveyed thought that radical land redistribution without compensation was going to harm the country. Yeah. So what this shows us is that this, amongst other issues, the youth are more concerned from a strategic longevity point of view of accessing basic services, of accessing healthcare, of accessing employment, rather than a lot of political rhetoric that they feel might destabilize the economy and the country. So that indication of 58% for the ANC, 12% for the DA and 9% for the EFF is not something to be excited about in terms of the ANC, is it? Because it's not necessarily growth.
It's not growth. I think that the ANC would be excited by the relatively low proportions of the other parties, but absolutely, we've seen across the board that the ANC has not managed to engage as much as they would have liked to. That being said, many elements of their manifesto speak directly to the youth, but that message hasn't been communicated as conveniently or as efficiently as it should have been.
What were the biggest takeaways of this poll, given the indicators of what South Africans want to see happening in terms of governance and government?
So the biggest indicator was to carry on being completely transparent. There's a slight distrust to the democratic process. I think that, again, because youth are so plugged into what's going on, you can see live on SABC what's happening in Parliament. There's this disillusionment that they want to be able to see the results of the manifestos come into fruition. They want to be able to trust into institutions to be able to deliver on their promises and not to be lost to the wayside of political rhetoric, not to be lost to the wayside of corruption.
Yeah. So 2 days away, what are your expectations of the youth like as we get to it now?
So I'm hoping that of the resurgence of those that have registered, the youth in general are a very passionate proportion of our population. And I'm hoping that they come out in their numbers to the polls. And those that didn't register will hopefully realize in these elections that the youth do, in fact, have a voice.
You lose out by not registering. Ruby Ichikowitz, thank you so much for coming through. Ruby is the youth director at the Ichikowitz Family Foundation.